A court in Saudi Arabia has sentenced 5 people to death for the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It also handed jail terms to 3 additional suspects in connection with the killing. Now, the Saudi writer and dissident was never seen again after entering the kingdom's consulate in Istanbul last year. He was killed and reportedly dismembered inside the building, but his remains were never found. Khashoggi was a resident of the United States at the time, and he was known for writing critically about the Saudi royal family. Let's bring in Toby Cadman now. He's an international human rights lawyer who has followed this case closely. Toby, thank you for joining us. What do you make of this verdict, and what can you tell us about the people who have been sentenced to death?
Thank you. I think one of the concerns that we have always expressed was that this was likely to be much of a whitewash, that it wasn't really a credible investigation, and it wasn't holding those individuals who were ultimately responsible, was not charging them. We've already heard today that 2 senior officials...
Thanks for having me.
Because these trials were carried out in near secrecy, do we really know at all if the charges and investigation were legitimate?
I think what we do know is what the Saudi regime wants us to know. We know what we've been briefed because, as you say, it was a closed-door trial. We don't really know to what extent there was evidence, to what extent the rule of law was followed, and to what extent there was scope for any type of proper defense, or whether this is just a regime narrative trying to draw this whole Khashoggi affair to an end.
Now, the Crown Prince has denied any knowledge of Khashoggi's killing, though the American CIA has reportedly found that MBS personally ordered it. There are questions of whether these death sentences are a way of silencing people who could know more. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. I find it very difficult to believe that an act such as this, which was obviously going to have very severe repercussions for the Saudi state, would not have been signed off by someone incredibly high up. And that person was most likely Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. But what I find interesting is that his chief ally...
Moving to Saudi Arabia, a court has sentenced 5 people to death for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Bloomberg's Riyadh Hamadi joins us now from Dubai. What's the latest, Riyadh?
Well, you said it, like there was a sentencing of 5 people to death, 3 people were sentenced to long jail sentences. However, what the court also did was exonerate 2 very senior officials of responsibility in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And the key in that is that it basically it ring fences the Crown Prince, who has been accused by some of basically being the one who ordered the murder. The court says there's no evidence of that. The court is now saying that the murder was not premeditated. There was no plan to murder Jamal Khashoggi, which runs counter to some of the leaks that the Turks and a report that the UN has published, which suggests there was at least some premeditation. So the critics of the Crown Prince will accuse the court here of covering up, in a way, the responsibility of the Crown Prince, and those who support him, as we're seeing sort of an outpouring on Twitter, the supporters of the Crown Prince, hailing Saudi justice and celebrating the exoneration of these key officials.
He was going to collect documents for his forthcoming marriage, but Jamal Khashoggi never came out of the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. As his fiancée waited outside, behind the closed doors, he was being murdered and dismembered. Today, after a trial condemned as a sham by the international community, Saudi Arabia said 5 men have been sentenced to death for his killing. But those closest to the kingdom's crown prince were cleared. A CIA investigation had earlier claimed the men were acting on the orders of Prince Mohammed bin Salman, something he has always denied. The United Nations continued to demand an independent criminal investigation into who ordered the killing.
So the trial really went after those that had the least capacities to defend themselves. It went after the hitmen, and it let the mastermind go free.
At the time of his death, Jamal Khashoggi was working for the Washington Post. Today,
Saudi Arabia has sentenced 5 people to death for the killing of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. The Virginia resident was last seen entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul last October. He was there to collect documents that would allow him to marry his Turkish fiancée. As she waited outside, Khashoggi was murdered. His body was reportedly dismembered and taken from the building. His remains have not been found. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has denied any knowledge of the operation. He received international condemnation because several Saudi agents involved in the killing worked directly for him. CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata is following the story from our London bureau. Charlie, thank you for joining us. What can you tell us about what took place during this trial? I know that a lot of it was kept private.
Yes, well, Catherine, not a lot. And the reason we can't tell you a lot about what's happened is because the press weren't invited to it. The media was not invited. It was not transparent. It took place over a course of 11 months, almost a full year. There were something like 11 defendants who were on trial. 5 of those defendants, you said, have been sentenced to death. Another 3, a number of lengthy jail terms. None of the defendants has been identified.
This morning, new developments in the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, a horrific killing that created international outrage last October. Now, new overnight, Saudi Arabia is announcing it has sentenced 5 men to death and 3 to prison over the columnist's killing after months of criticism over how the country has handled the investigation. NBC's Keir Simmons is in our London bureau with the latest.
Hey, Hallie, good morning to you. This morning, Saudi Arabia will be looking to send a tough message and hoping that it can move on from the crisis that engulfed the country this year, a crisis that has been described by some as the worst for Saudi Arabia since 9/11. But this announcement does not include punishment for the former advisor to the Crown Prince, and that will be questioned by many people. This morning, death sentences for the murderers of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The Saudi public prosecutor announcing capital punishment for 5 individuals for committing and directly participating in the murder of the victim. Another 3 men were sentenced to a total of